Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Samantha Ratnam. I'm the leader of the Victorian Greens and will be the facilitator for today's webinar. We really appreciate you making the time to join our conversation about why we need more public housing in Victoria. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also acknowledge that I know there'll be many of you calling from different First Nations lands right across this state, perhaps around the country as well. You're welcome to, in the chat box, if you would like to, you can do your own acknowledgement from the land you are calling from. You're most welcome to. You don't have to, but you're welcome to use the chat function. It's often a really nice way to connect with where everyone is calling from as well and pay our First Nations. Today we'll be talking about why Victoria needs a big build of public housing and why now is the time for our governments to be investing in this type of infrastructure. You may have heard the Greens talking about our plan for a Green New Deal recently, which essentially is our plan that will tackle climate change, address inequality and help build a caring society and clean economy for us all while we create the jobs that we need. We think that a big build of public housing needs to be part of a Green New Deal. The COVID pandemic that we are all experiencing has thrown a spotlight on just how broken Victoria's housing system is and how reform is so long overdue. Housing is an essential service, but for too long, housing has been set up to favour profit over secure, affordable housing for everyone. And so we know that a big build of public housing is the first step to end homelessness in Victoria, plus creating the jobs that we need. It'll create over 10,000 jobs, 1,000 apprenticeships. And if you think about the moment that we're in at the moment with the pandemic, it's really important. Governments are going to be they're already starting to make really significant decisions about how we rebuild the economy post the pandemic. And what essentially a Green New Deal says is that governments should be making decisions and investments in things that at the same time solve the big climate and environment and social inequality issues that we face at a time that they're reinvesting and reinvigorating the economy. So rather than go back to business as usual, and a business as usual scenario in Victoria, for example, where we have over 100,000 people on the public housing waiting list, which is totally unacceptable. We have over 25,000 people who are homeless on any given night in Victoria. We think these are the types of issues that the government should be putting a spotlight on and in making the big investments in as soon as possible. I'm so pleased today to be joined by our guest and our guest speaker, who I'm looking forward to the conversation with, Associate Professor Julie Lawson from RMIT Centre for Urban Research. Julie is an urban researcher and international housing policy analyst, works on housing policy in Australia, in Europe, and in international forums like the UN. She has researched and written extensively on housing affordability and has been following and contributing to the public policy discussions and solutions in Victoria over many years. Hi Julie, thanks so much for joining us, and a especially big thank you for joining us because you're not currently in our time zone. You're currently dialing in from the Netherlands where it's 5 a.m. in the morning, so we are especially appreciative of your time with us today.
No problem at all, and it's wonderful to be with you all actually, and back in my hometown. So I'm honoured to be asked, and I'd be happy to move through some insights if I can share them also. Fantastic. From also what's happening in Europe and the emphasis that's being placed on a much more social Green Deal, if you like, an inclusive Green Deal, and the kind of instruments and what countries are doing, and that Victoria would by no means be out of place to join some of the leading countries on this issue, Denmark, Austria, France, and so on. But it's also just good policy. But you asked the questions, Samantha, and I'll
Certainly.
see if I can.
Thank you, Julie. So I might just run through how the webinar is going to work for all the people watching us and participating, and then we might launch into some questions. But welcome again, Julie, and we're so thankful for you being here with us, and I'm really looking forward to delving into some of the detail a bit more. So in terms of how the webinar is going to run this afternoon, Julie and I will talk about why Victoria needs more public housing, particularly at this time. And as Julie mentioned, doing a bit of a scan of the international context as well. This is an unprecedented stuff. We can do it here in Victoria. We will then open up to questions, and we really welcome your questions. So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Some of you started using that already. Let us know if you have any trouble with using that. And what we'll do is we'll keep scanning those questions, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we possibly can. So we'll open up with a little bit of a Q&A, and then we'll open it up to discussions and questions as well. So get typing, and we look forward to hearing your responses. So we might set off then in terms of the questions. So Julie, I wanted to ask firstly, could you talk us through why you think it's an especially important time now for governments to be investing in public housing?
Well, not only is there a major backlog in need because of this investment over a very long period of time, also because of sales also sometimes of strategic land, which is an incredibly valuable resource, but also simply because of well-established evidence of need. So, I mean, you can have need measured in all types of different ways, and you can even have a waiting list, for example. But that we know that not everybody signs up for those lists, so it's important then to go back to some perhaps more reliable sources, and we did that in 2016 using the census, also using the ABS census of homelessness, which has a definition of homelessness which also includes people who are living in inadequate, substandard, overcrowded housing, which is something Australia does recognise as being, if you like, a form of homelessness as well. So you've got street homelessness, but you've also got people living in overcrowded dwellings or couch surfing and those kind of things. So the level of that need is extraordinarily high. And if I can just share with you what we found in let me see if I can share my screen. Oh, great. I'm sorry, the host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, we might try and fix it up. And yes, I've had that issue with webinars before. We've got a tech team behind the scenes here, so we might get onto that and allow you to share those screens as well. Oh, yep.
Very good. And I can try again.
Try again.
Yeah. So if we go, we have
fantastic. I think that's starting to work. Awesome.
All right. Review slideshow. I've got a couple of slides up here. This is you can see a very extensive lot of numbers here, in which we looked at Australia, we looked also at states, we looked at Victoria. Within Victoria, we looked at a whole number of regions, also parts of Melbourne, and that clearly showed evidence of what we call manifest need, which is actual homelessness, evident need, which is also including those people who are in housing stress, and we totaled that up to be what would be the extreme need. So this is a need amongst very low income people. But of course, there are those whose low and moderate income are also in housing need. So these numbers are even greater but the bulk of the need is amongst those who have a low income, a very low income. But I guess the other aspect, of course, now, if we can go back to looking at what's happening in with COVID, of course, is that you can see COVID in particular has highlighted how vulnerable we are, not just as a sort of a society, but in a workplace with precarious work contracts, but our housing system also, especially in the private rental sector. So the needs there have been proven to be really acute. Also those who are working in particular sectors of the economy on flex contracts, international students. For many, of course, sheltering at home isn't possible. if they don't have a home at all. And those who are in more institutional accommodation are particularly vulnerable, where they're overcrowded and suffer from, potential infections, health risks. So housing and the health aspects of housing have become more important now with COVID. So overcrowding has become a health issue. A health issue is an issue for all of us. Also, what's highlighted, of course, is the risk of unsafe homes where domestic violence is a problem. So we know that this pandemic, although it seems to be overcome at the moment, it could come back. We're vulnerable to this disruption again. And nobody really wants to go back to this situation happening over and over and over again. So, I mean, and it's quite amazing actually what governments have been prepared to do. So, right across the world, you see evictions, moratoriums, or a stop on evictions, also deferment of rent payments, sometimes in some countries actually reducing rents, and for homeowners also assistance, for households and for the homeless, also taking on actions that were never before thought of as possible. Turning five-star hotels in Paris into places that people can sleep and stay overnight. These are things that, we thought weren't possible, but now we're doing it. Now we're doing it. The impossibles become the possible. And when we think about, investing in large-scale public housing, it's not long ago when that was the case. So we were building, in fact, around 14,000 dwellings a year, right up until the early 1980s. And we forgot that has been possible in the 90s and the 2000s. And they've dwindled down to around about 3,000 per year across the nation. But of course, in the past, as a nation, we have invested and used social housing to invest during periods of crisis. The guidance for the recovery, which is coming from the OECD and coming from the UN Habitat, is to make that recovery stimulus more purposeful, make it big enough to make a difference, make sure it's delivered in a timely way without it being overly slow and bureaucratic, but also really make sure that it delivers an economy for the future, that it has environmental benefits, that it steers the economy to perform in a much more purposeful way for future generations as well. So the idea of building back better and building more energy efficient and more inclusive stimulus, and that these kind of urgent guidance is coming out only as last of Friday, for example, from the OECD, telling governments, please make your recovery plans much more about inclusive stimulus and energy efficiency. Think about the future and make sure that any Green New Deal that you make is concerned also about social inclusion and social justice. So you see even in the European Commission, for example, with its Just Transition Fund, they've massively expanded that fund from 7 billion up to 40 billion. And you see that being targeted also to areas that have to deal with a transition to a new green economy, to ensure that those workers in those former polluting industries, etc., have opportunities, have the skills, and also live in good housing. So you see all kinds of interesting things going on.
Julie, do you mind, sorry to interrupt,
Yep.
but I do want to pick up some really interesting things that you've raised, because we're moving into some of the how, and which is, I think, a really important focus for the next part of the discussion. I want to touch on the why a little bit more, which you've highlighted. Those numbers of building, in the past we built 14,000 dwellings per year, and that was kind of what was considered normal, and that governments have kind of retreated away from it, you know, and there's lots to unpack there in terms of the motivations and what is driving some of those things. And even in terms of the numbers you've talked about, where potentially, like we quote, the Public Housing Inquiry found that there's, you know, there were 85,000 at that time. It's now risen to 100,000 people on the waiting list and growing every single month. But in some ways, you're saying that actually there's a hidden population within that number actually doesn't get the true quantum of the problem. Yet we've had kind of a model in Australia of housing, when affordable housing's talked about, where it's moved to this model of kind of vulnerability, where they say, oh, governments should only intervene to provide housing for the people in the most extreme of circumstances, in the most extreme of circumstances. So they've kind of moved away from this idea of what a government's responsibility is in providing housing for citizens and this concept of universal housing. I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit before we go into the implementation as well, in terms of what is that kind of concept of universal housing? How are other countries doing some of this policy response?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, the rationing that's happened in Australia since the 1970s has been brought about by simply that there is not enough, and that the proportion is incredibly small compared to other countries. So, I mean, I think we should be aiming to get up around the mid-teens in terms of the proportion of social housing, which makes a housing system work well. And that would mean also a more inclusive social housing that isn't just what we'd call an emergency service when people really fall out of the boat, but is much more of part of the social economy, that people have choices to be part of a cooperative or part of a not-for-profit housing system or part of a more, you know, uncommodified way of sharing and living in a home. So you see countries, Finland's a great example, and Austria too, where there are a whole range of options that people can have, not just, you know, raving it at an auction or lining up to try and rent a dwelling. But there are genuinely choices that yes, social housing or public housing can be considered as sort of a refuge, but it can also be an oasis. It can also be a stepping stone. It can also be part of a lifelong plan. And that's something which should be embraced. The way in which we see our public health system or our right to education. I mean, taking a much more rights-based approach is something which we should aspire to, which the UN is telling us to aspire to. The Sustainable Development Goals are telling us we should all have a right to housing for all. So, you know, why make your housing, the social part of your housing system, simply just for when you fall out of the boat? It needs to be a much bigger boat than that, I think.
Absolutely. So, and what we've seen in terms of the public policy response is kind of how that's been formalized and codified by governments is you have these much more stringent criteria that just get more and more stringent. That means that people aren't able to access housing that is government supported in any way. And I think, and then they've used that to justify, although the lists have been growing, it's been used to justify the dwindling investment in housing that governments have been making over many years as well. So it's kind of this vicious cycle that's started now, it feels like.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, so you really need to make arguments about the equity investment in expanding supply. And that also comes hand in hand with embracing a much wider allocation to involving the community more broadly. It also helps to give it actually some kind of more legitimacy and acceptance by the community, and rather than it being set aside or perhaps sadly stigmatized as a last resort. So moving away from those kind of things. And I actually had a nice sort of slide which I wanted to share with you. I'll just see if I can get it up on the screen again. Yeah, it was something that we used when we and I've sort of evolved a little bit since then. I don't know if you can see that.
Ah, yes.
It's just an idea of just trying to change the conversation, not just talking about public housing in terms of it being in crisis, but actually seeing it as something which can contribute to a more stable and, if you like, just economy. And also seeing it not as part of as being a problem, but part of the solution. So not just in more broad-based housing options, but also creating more stable economy. And we see that happening in countries like Austria, where social partners, they call them, the unions, the political parties, business, actually see stable housing production as being part of a stable economy as well. They have much more long-term views about its role, and the affordable housing sector produces around 22% of the dwellings and in the entire housing construction scene. So it's a very important economic stabiliser. We also have to start being clever about not just putting our money into funding expensive finance. This is a big issue that you see it moving in the childcare sector, you see it happening in health. Who are we actually subsidising here? So we have to move from the idea of investing or subsidising finance to investing in homes, or investing in the public estate, investing in something which is for all our future. And not just for profits, if you like, from those who are engaged in it. I think in that conversation we have to be very careful about the role even of our superannuation funds, and look at, are they investing in a model which is about rates of return and extracting from that, or are they investing, say, in the really long-term, low-cost investment? That's what we want from them if they're going to play a role, not what we do. There's a difference between extractive investment and constructive investment in this regard.
Julie, you've written, sorry to interrupt, but you've written about the housing, needing to look at housing as social infrastructure.
Yep.
Is this what you mean by that, or could you tell us a little bit more about what happens when you see housing more as social infrastructure as opposed to how we've seen governments move to thinking about housing?
Yeah. Well, this is about valuing public housing, actually, and the way in which we think about it. Why wouldn't you have a like any infrastructure? Infrastructure is something which sits underneath something, if you like. Is supports or enables a society or an economy to function well. And certainly housing is an essential part of that. But for some reason we put that aside and we say, oh no, that's something we just sort out as on our own, and we make our own way. But we know that actually governments can make an enormous difference to being able to do that. I mean, they can influence the land policies, the involvement in the land market, through our planning system, through actually getting involved in the land market and also the housing market. And why would they do that? Well, of course we know how important housing is to people's security. Security is so important. So we've seen in the current crisis, for example, how that security has been affected. People don't know if they can pay the next month's rent. That's really shaking up families' physical and mental health, worries about the kids, trying to keep them securely in their local school, their neighbourhood that they're part of. If you don't have security, it's very difficult to get up in the morning and put that suit on and leave a happy home behind, etc. It's just, security is essential. So also we wouldn't want some to be secure and others not to be. So social equity is core. Why wouldn't we want to get involved in shaping a better market? Why would we just leave it up to the private sector, which is not going to solve many problems we have. If we did so, we probably have urban sprawl now that extended up to the Murray. I mean, we would have very expensive cities of which people are making long commutes to come into town. So we need to shape much better markets, much better cities through our urban planning to maximise the social, economic and environmental outcomes for all. We get involved to make better societies, better housing markets, but we also get involved to avoid the costs, because what if we didn't do these things? I mean, think about the costs in terms of, well, we talked a little bit about that long commute, but inadequate, insecure, unaffordable housing costs not only the household a lot, but it costs the whole community as well. I mean, it can be infrastructure costs, expensive roads extending out to the outer suburbs, but it can also be in, health costs of poor, damp, insecure housing, or of also that related to crime, people trying to make do, being outside the system. So the costs, and they've been added up, are extensive. And there are specialists who have been working on that area, like Cameron Parcell, but also that's being taken on board by economists inside Infrastructure Victoria too. Yes. And there's some really good thinking that's going on there. I
Thanks
mentioned
so
a bit. Yep. Last thing is just, we shouldn't just think of public housing as being an ambulance service. We should think about it as making better markets rather than addressing market failure.
Thanks so much, Julie. And sorry to cut you off. We've got so much to talk about and look forward to continuing the conversation. There's so many layers in that. And as you've kind of demonstrated, the costs of not acting to invest in public housing, to move towards universal housing, are so great, so layered and so complex. And it, kind of beggars belief when you really think about all the social issues and economic issues too that arise from when governments withdraw from the investment in public housing, why governments aren't taking up the mantle to do more now and letting the system deteriorate to this kind of unacceptable position. But we might open that up, and I think we've got some questions along those lines as well. I'm going to, there's a whole number of areas that we want to delve into in a bit more detail, but we're getting a few questions coming through as well. So I'm going to open it up. And just before we do that, we have Deb. I wanted to bring Deb up onto the screen, who's been very kind in offering to share her story. So Deb's been living in public housing for a number of years. We're just getting the technology set up.
Can you help me? Can't see it.
We can hear you, Deb. I think we can hear you. Can't see you. Yes, we can hear you, Deb.
You can't see me today, but you can hear me.
Yes, that's all good. So, Deb, thanks so much for joining us. I wondered if you would mind sharing with us what's been your experience of public housing and what's it meant for you?
I've lived in public housing for about 20 years. I think it's like Julie was saying, sort of like the ambulance sort of experience, that it took for me to be very unwell and growing disability and things to actually achieve public housing, but it was an extremely long battle. It was like they wanted me to drop off the list and I had to keep fighting, which then had more impact on my health and wellness. That I kept dropping off the list. I had to keep calling them, and then they had me in the wrong area, and it took years to get public housing. The housing I'm in now is beautiful. It's a standalone 110-year-old house in Brunswick. That I'm very fortunate, but it shouldn't be so hard for people. I mean, the systems really seems to be set up to fail. It's just, and I've got a family member who recently achieved public housing too, who's got a psychosocial disability. And the experience is just ambulance, it should be, sorry, I'm all over the place, but
no problem.
My experience is that public housing gets such a bad rap. It's seen as, you're rarely down the bottom, and And it really needs to, as Julie was saying, needs to be a wider conversation. It needs to be seen as something that more people get access to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the difficulty is, I mean, with public housing, you have some rights, but it's very hard to get the rights adhered to, if you know what I mean. You're fighting for everything, and at least you have more rights than you do under social housing model.
But it's still been a struggle. I think that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing your story, Debbie, just in terms of even the journey to be able to access the limited housing that was available, and how difficult that was, and how in a way it feels like the system is set up to make it very difficult. And we're certainly hearing a number of stories right across the board. You know, as governments have basically pulled their investment from public housing, it's quite literal now and obvious what's happening in Victoria, for example, with the public housing renewal program. I wonder as well if you could talk about, once they were able to match up some housing for you, what that meant to you, and can you talk us a little bit to us about that experience?
Yes, I think the impact on your health, your inclusion in your local area, your ability to participate is just incredible. I mean, it's just, it locks people. Without having stable housing, everything falls away. Your health, your participation, your inclusion is just incredible. It just makes such a big difference.
Thanks so much, Dev. That's really important for us to hear your insights from your direct experience as well. And certainly I feel like it's shared from the things that we're hearing from people from a range of areas. Last week in the Parliament, we introduced a bill for a public housing ombudsman in response to a number of public housing tenants saying that they're not just getting the responsiveness from the department to do the basic maintenance for their properties. You know, it feels like it's being left to run into the ground, and what then you have is these areas of public housing buildings that then the government says, oh, sorry, it's just deteriorated so much that we're going to have to knock it down and we're going to replace it with private dwellings and some social housing. But it feels like they didn't take the opportunity to keep up with the maintenance to make sure that they didn't fall into that type of disrepair. So once again, that vicious cycle and systemic. So this is what we're talking about, kind of the system responses and what happens at the end as well. Thanks so much, Deb, for joining us, and you're going to stay with us as well. Feel free to jump back in. I might take some questions. We've got lots of questions piling up now, so we might start some questions. And the first one is from Elaine. Thanks, Elaine, for the question, who asked, what's the relationship between domestic violence and a lack of housing? What housing options are available to women over 55? Julie, did you want to tackle this one? I'm happy to jump in as well if needed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a clear relationship between having a safe home and not having an option to go to. You know, if you don't have a safe home and you don't have an option to go to, you're more likely to put up with a situation which is intolerable and potentially very, very dangerous. So, you know, insufficient public housing and options to quickly exit to is actually not just a health issue. It's a profound need to have that option. That's what I meant by a safe refuge or an oasis. An oasis should be available for those who are in a threatening situation, but it's not, and it's just not enough. And there are many out there advocating for more responsiveness. There was also something which Deb said about a lack of responsiveness and the treatment being pushed to come off the list. I think that also needs to be tackled. There's been a lot of emphasis the last 20, 30 years on new models and community-based models, but perhaps we also need to be demanding and expecting best practice in management and governance from our public housing provision as well. I mean, we have very large public housing organisations. Interestingly, when we did a big four-country study, I learnt a lot about how public housing authorities in the United States are actually managed with quite democratic governance structures, and involving the local mayor, those with a strong advocacy role in the local city or county, in representatives from consumer organisations. So it's broken down to much smaller, more responsive. So public housing can be better governed and more responsive. I think that's quite interesting. And also there are many, many more of them. There are 1,200 public housing authorities in the United States. It's quite amazing. And we have just a handful. So those kind of governance structures, making them more connected, more partnered with the community, perhaps working with the health services and local schools, everything from connecting and playing a positive role in the community. So it's not so perhaps distant and siloed and separate. Those things really can be reformed and improved. They just need some concerted effort and attention.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Julie. And talking about investment, we have a question from Warwick, who asks, what's an ideal model for securing funds to invest in public housing in Australia?
Well, we looked at five different models, and actually looked at the cost to government of those. And in fact, it surprised everybody, not everybody, but many people, that a greater proportion of direct public investment is actually cheaper in the long run. The cost of financing, the complexities, they can lead to undesirable outcomes. Also for the government itself, in terms of the cost of financing and lease contracts and those kind of things. And you see those costs also having an impact in other forms of infrastructure, in the way we are funding and financing childcare, roads, our public transport system. So if you have, there's some very good researchers also working in that field. David Hayward is one of them, former Vice Chancellor from RMIT, who every year has been monitoring the budget of the Victorian government and looking at the rising proportion of going towards finance and lease contracts. We looked at 5 different models, and we found that having a substantial portion of direct public investment, retaining an equity share in that asset, is actually the most cost effective. In fact, it was 24% more cost effective than simply financing that commercially and ending up having to pay the long-term interest costs over time through other forms of public subsidy. So having to pay through either more tenant rent or through relying more often on Commonwealth rent assistance. So you can see the modelling in that report. It's free, available online. We've been pushing it around to treasuries to say, have a look at this, because, while public borrowing costs are so low, you really need to be utilising that for the benefit of all Victorians in the long term, rather than saddling the country with long-term debt obligations. And we see what a mess the United Kingdom got into with this, and their National Audit Office reports in 2012, 2015, 2018, all warning the government of the rising time bomb of these finance and lease contracts. So they stopped actually, and in end of 2018, they no longer do PFIs. So that PFI is a private financing initiative. So I think we need to get far faster ahead of the curve and utilise our public borrowing capacities more effectively. We should think of it in terms of an investment in the future rather than a cost. You know, it's not like a household. We've got generations of taxpayers that sit behind public investment. So if the borrowing costs are so low, this is the time when we should be doing that direct state public investment up front as much as possible to reduce the long-term financing costs. So the whole conversation around debt and debt investment, that's changing. The OECD is changing. You know, it's no longer the old line.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point too. And you started off at the start of the conversation talking about public land sales. So in terms of governments actually investing in things, you know, housing is an asset in so many other ways. It's thought about it as an asset, but when it comes to public housing and government's intervention, they somehow change the model conveniently and don't see it as that. And we're seeing quite aggressive sales of public land, for example, at the moment in Victoria, land that's prime. There are prime locations ideal to build more public housing on. So at the same time, they should be keeping the asset that they do have, the land, so we can build more public housing. They're selling off the land and retreating from their investments. So it's so counterintuitive to solving the problem before us as well. Speaking of which, we've got some questions about Victoria's public housing renewal program, and I was looking through that you'd actually made a submission to the Victorian parliamentary inquiry a couple of years ago on the public housing renewal program, and within that you were felt like you were arguing for a much more ambitious build of public housing as opposed to the renewal program that was proposed by the government. Can you talk us through what drove that submission to that inquiry?
Well, it's not just my research. It's so many reports have been written by the Auditor Generals, by the Australian Housing and Urban and Research Institute, saying to governments over the last 30 years is you have to be far more use the tools that you have in your hands. Use your capacity to manage land resources more effectively and plan with those, to coordinate with each other for needs-based investment. You have those resources, you have advisory bodies telling you to do this. In Infrastructure Victoria, for example, placed social housing investment on its, I think, third on its many hundreds of objectives. Social housing is way up there, and you hear now the Productivity Commission also saying the same things, is that it's about time, but it's been about time for a very long time. So I mean, that submission, you know, brought together many different aspects. You know, you can please draw on that, arguing for greater, more purposeful investment in Victorians' future, and also aligning with goals like the Sustainable Development Goals, and doing what they've signed up to. So when next you know, priorities are to be, budgets are to be made, of course, these are the things that we need to be saying loud and clear. But beyond that direct investment, you mentioned the land aspect. I mean, we've just finished another major international review since that social housing is infrastructure research project. And now I'm actually right in the middle of writing the Housing 2030, which is Europe's, if you like, 10-year looking ahead. One of the chapters in that is all about land and all around the best practices of land for more affordable and inclusive communities. And there are examples of how to do that from all around the world. But in Australia, of course, we have had in our land development corporations a market player which can influence. We have and still have a planning system which can be utilised more effectively, not just in inclusionary zoning, but also in zoning itself. I mean, Vienna, for example, has a zone for affordable key worker housing, has a land banker which privileges and prioritises partners who will provide affordable housing. So these are standards of best practice internationally. We should be learning from those. But also land leasing. It's not necessary for developments to own the land they rest on. We have examples of that in our own country. Canberra is one, where the whole development costs, land components, especially in the middle inner areas, are often a huge proportion of the overall development costs. You don't need to own them, you can simply lease them. If you've got a purposeful partner involved, and what more purposeful partner would there be than hopefully your government? So, you know, one should expect that they simply don't, what they cannibalise their resources and sell off those key sites, but use them for the greater public good in the long term.
Thanks so much, Julie. I'm looking at the time as well. I've got to be mindful of time. We're coming to a close, so we can't get to all the questions, but we'll endeavour to get responses to everyone. So sorry if we haven't been able to ask you a question. We've been talking about the very compelling reasons why government should be investing in public housing, the benefits for society in the long term for generations to come. And Jack's asked a very pertinent question. We've had to summarise the question just for the sake of time, but despite the compelling nature for the need for investment and governments invest in public housing, Julie, why do you think governments are not doing it? I mean, we have some international examples where they are moving in that direction, but in Australia, for example, we see quite the opposite and quite the retreat from the public provision of housing. What are your thoughts on the challenges and obstacles and why governments aren't building more housing to get at least get that waiting list down as a starting point?
Well, you might want to listen to perhaps a political scientist, or but I mean, there's a few ideas. Perhaps where are the voice of public tenants perhaps needs to be stronger. But of course, people need to be listening. I think at this moment there is a groundswell of support and concern for a broader-based sector, which. And you see that in the editorials of major newspapers. Only last week, the Sydney Morning Herald led with an editorial calling for more social housing. And by that, I think they often mean public housing, actually. It's so tiny as a sector. It's 3.5% or so in Victoria. So perhaps there are also many vested interests, of course, for those who don't like to rock the boat and but that doesn't mean that can't be turned around. And I'm ever optimistic. And in the goodness of the Australian public, actually, and that deep down, I think people are much more compassionate than we give them credit for. That we need to tap into those values and say, well, actually, we can do better. We can be more ambitious. So I also think we need to call our governments to account more often, also our public housing managers to account, to pressure them through peer review of better practice, peer review also from abroad, to give them courage to say to their senior managers, hey, no, I think we can do better. I want to be part of a positive public housing system. I want to be part of, you know, a professional movement that tries to do something really good, and that, you know, make public housing cool. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Julie. We're nearing the end of our time, so I wanted to open up to some final thoughts and comments from the panel. We haven't been able to get all the questions. There's a few other questions from Cass. I think we've answered some of this before, which was what the impact of COVID-19 has been on the need for public housing. I think, Julie, you were talking to that at the start of the presentation in terms of kind of the health dimension and the social dimension. We've talked about family violence, so the stressors increasing the need, the demand as well, but also interestingly, in terms of government responses, we have seen, and certainly we've seen in Victoria, matching what you were describing of governments across the world, is suddenly governments doing things that they said were impossible before. So, for example, they doubled some emergency funding to ensure that people who were sleeping rough could be provided with temporary shelter, and were able to house thousands of people, whereas a couple of months before it seemed impossible. And the housing sector and the homelessness sector now is saying, well, the next step is we've got to make sure that those thousands of people that have been housed in emergency accommodation during the pandemic for health reasons shouldn't be poured back out onto the streets. There's actually been a model where we've been able to provide some support, and we're still waiting for the government to respond to that, about what happens to those thousands of people who've been put into emergency accommodation right across Australia. So suddenly the impossible seems possible, and I think that'll be the next critical step to see how governments respond, and we're doing everything that we can to advocate and put pressure on them to ensure that there are long-term solutions to respond as well. So there have been some interesting things that we've observed. I might open it up for some final comments. I'm just going to ask Deb, by no means do you have to, but were there any final observations or comments that you wanted to make before we wind up? And then I'll throw it to Julie for the final comments. We might come back to Deb in a second. Julie, we also had some other questions around what the role of voluntary and not-for-profit organisations could be with meeting demand. There was a question on why so much public housing is vacant. I think that was from Richard, and that was in reference to the public housing renewal program, which is what we've also seen. This pandemic has hit at a time when the public housing renewal program, which is essentially privatising so much of our public housing, particularly in the inner city, they moved residents out of those estates in preparation for demolition, and so they were sitting empty during this time of the last few months with not much being able to happen. So I think that question was in reference to that. And there's a whole heap of other great questions which we would endeavour to get some individual responses to you as well. But would you like to make some concluding comments?
Yeah, the question about the renewal, extraordinary. I mean, also perhaps about the poor maintenance of many of the dwellings. Very pleased to see that there will be a significant effort in that. But the question perhaps also then needs to be, well, how did it get to that state? And what would be the long-term maintenance, and we need to look at how that came to be. And there are some major questions that were asked by the Auditor General so they still really haven't been properly answered. However, the other issue they're sometimes responding is that if we spend it all on maintenance, we can't do anything on new build. So, but all that comes down to is a severe problem in the investment, and also perhaps lack of revenue as well, which is, you know, very low revenue streams coming in, whether that be in a operating subsidy or in the rents themselves. So, you know, there's a fundamental business model problem that needs to be addressed front on. calling for more exposure of how that is actually working. We had some suggestions in our review about how that could work better in the future. I won't take up any more time now, but I do think we're at, to some degree, a historic opportunity in arguing for a change in thinking. With sadly, in every crisis, there's an opportunity to reconsider the way we look at the role of governments in investing in our futures, the role of debt, how we should see that, if we should see that as an investment in the long term, social and economic well-being. So those things, we need to grasp that moment and utilise it to the advantage of better housing and a better housing system.
I think that's a great point, a very poignant point to end on, Julie. It is, there is a moment, there's an opportunity for governments to grasp this moment, and certainly we'll be doing everything that we possibly can to put as much of the spotlight on the need for governments to invest in housing. They are making some extraordinary decisions with huge quantums of money, which is needed for the rebuilding of the economy, given what's happened. So there is an absolute, there has been an urgent need for them to respond to this issue for a long time. It's just become even more urgent, and the case is so compelling. Thanks so much for your providing insights into your research. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people looking up and following your research following this discussion. And we're especially thankful that you joined us at the crack of dawn, literally the crack of dawn from where you're living at the moment.
The sun's come up.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, that's a nice reflection on this conversation as well. We look forward to talking to you more, Julie. We thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And we know that researchers and people like you add so much to this public policy discussion. Like you said, we've got to empower the voices that and help governments listen. They should be opening their ears a lot more, but every voice matters here. And I want to, on that note as well, thank everyone who's joined the webinar. I know some of you might have joined the previous one that we did with Libby Porter as well. And I know you're all doing incredible advocacy and practical work on the ground in communities right across Victoria. So I want to thank everyone who's joined the call, who's active in the fight for more public housing in Victoria. And we certainly will continue that push, and let's hope we see some positive results very, very soon. So we might wrap it up there, and thanks everyone for the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We'll endeavour to provide more responses and have more conversations on these topics going forward. So we might sign off there. Thanks everyone for joining.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks so much, Julie. All the very best.